Here's a fun thing to notice in the Mrs. Hawking series. Each show contains at least one major fight sequence that's important to the story. But beyond being narratively important, fights can show us a lot about a character, like their background and their motivation or internal conflicts. For example, Mrs. Hawking is a trained dancer. Her fluid movements are also informed by significant martial training, likely gleaned from her adolescence in Singapore. She knows how to use her smaller size and momentum against a larger, stronger opponent. We also see that she will not stop until she has won, even if she's injured in the process, suggesting that her anger often drives her. She's also driven by a need to prove herself as capable as any man, and she wields a traditionally masculine weapon. Kukris were military knives used in South Asia, and legend holds that, once drawn, the knife must taste blood. So her weapon alludes not only to Mrs. Hawking's upbringing in Asia, but also to her disregard for gender norms and her need to always complete her mission at any cost, regardless of whose blood is spilled, including her own. Mary is a little more circumspect in her style. She's a strong arm, but doesn't have as much formal combat training. She uses her formidable strength, developed over years of being a caretaker and maid, and a fire poker to overwhelm her opponents. Her weapon of choice is something she's familiar with from her day-to-day duties, but it's also an indication that she isn't willing to go as far as Mrs. Hawking to win.
Well, what else can be done to stop him? For a villain of this stripe, I can think of something. I'm sure that doesn't sit quite right with me, even for a brute like that.
While Hawking's weapon is lethal, Mary's is more likely to give a thug a bad headache. It's a tool conventionally associated with women, used in an unconventional way, suggesting that while Mary sees injustice in the world and is willing to step outside social norms to correct them, she perhaps isn't as completely dismissive of these norms as Mrs. Hawking is. Nathaniel is more traditional in his thinking than Mrs. Hawking or Mary, but he does have an honest desire to do good.
Mary's had to defend herself, and she's just a girl.
Sir!
Oh, no offense intended, Mary, but if you can swing that fireplace poker of yours, surely I'm worth a crack or two.
He's willing to learn to fight, and he gravitates towards the Victorian boxing stance historically favored by gentlemen of this era, which makes sense, given that he was raised a gentleman, but his style betrays a lack of real-world experience. Nathaniel typically seeks other solutions to conflicts, but when he does engage physically, he holds himself stiffly and is obviously uncomfortable. His approach is tentative, his swings are slow, and he hasn't quite found his center of gravity. While his fighting style may not be entirely effective, Nathaniel fares far better in social situations where he can spar verbally instead of physically. Will Nathaniel learn to hold his own in a fistfight? Watch the virtual premiere of Mrs. Frost in January to find out, and join us live at Arisia this January to see how fights set the stage for our newest show, In the Bones.